Hey guys, welcome. Very happy to be here. I'm Dave Paprocki, head of marketing here at MetaRouter, and we're talking a little bit about how to turn your customer data into your competitive advantage in 2024. So very excited. I'm joined today by our head of product here at MetaRouter, Greg Brunk, as well as Nick Iyengar, who's VP of Analytics at Merkle Cardinal Path. So Nick, thank you for joining us. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Greg, this will go to you. Can you talk a little bit and explain the implications of the impending loss of third-party cookies and how it will impact businesses and advertisers this year and beyond?
Yeah, for sure. Probably the most important place to start is that this isn't really new. Third-party cookies have been dying bit by bit for a very long time. Cookies are primarily a means for a browser to store an identifier that allows various different components of an advertising network to communicate with each other. And it's that freedom of that communication and probably to some degree a history of potential exploitation of that identification that I think has ultimately caused Google to envision a new model. For a long time, others like Safari and Firefox have been slowly reducing the access and efficacy of access to identifiers to be used in ad networks, and now Google's following suit. It's mostly being done under the guise of privacy, and I think that's a huge motivator for a lot of these changes in technology. I think there are other things that can be gained by some of these changes, but I think primarily it's a privacy-centric effort. And I think where really Google started and where Safari started and is targeting the third-party cookie. And the way third-party cookies work is that when you visit any sort of website on the internet, oftentimes there will be third-party tags, other companies other than the company that you're visiting. So let's say you're going to ESPN, there may be a Trade Desk tag on ESPN that's dropping a cookie that identifies you as a user within their advertising network. And that way, when you navigate to other places other than ESPN, they still, if they're running there, they can look in that cookie and understand who you are, depending on where you are in the distributed network. And that allows them to do things like do targeted advertisements. It also allows them to collect things like conversion to help know whether or not people are actually purchasing the product or visiting the site that the advertisement is trying to drive traffic into. So these IDs are really central to both the publisher side where the ads are being shown and the demand side, which is where ideally the advertisements are driving users to engage. It's important that those two sides of the equation can communicate on an ID, and largely those IDs are going to be going away. Google is generally proposing a new framework for how the publishing and demand side and all the other various different ecosystems that depend on advertising or support advertising, they're proposing a new framework for how that communication can exist. And instead of it being an anonymous identifier or several anonymous identifiers that all these different sort of ad tech tooling can use to communicate, protected APIs within Chrome become that new communication point. And in particular, those are the Privacy Sandbox APIs, which is the Protected Audience API, the Attribution and Reporting API, and the Topics API are being proposed as a new model, a new framework where publishing side and demand side advertising ecosystems can come together and communicate. And instead of that being done kind of in back-end databases based on IDs, it's going to be done right in the browser. And most of the information is going to be stored there, encrypted there, processed there. That's kind of the Google approach to this particular problem, which I think is the one that's most relevant to the common death of cookies conversation.
Yeah, it's a rapidly changing landscape, no doubt. Nick, can you elaborate a little further from your point of view, what you're seeing with Merkle Cardinal Path customers and beyond?
Yeah, definitely. So just to expand a little bit on what Greg has been talking about with the kind of obvious implications for things like paid media, retargeting, and stuff like that. We see third-party cookie loss as sort of one specific item in a broader set of changes that are happening in the industry. We call that data deprecation or signal loss, while third-party cookie loss tends to get a lot of the headlines just because there's so much money tied up in programmatic media and that kind of stuff. A lot of other aspects of performance marketing, digital analytics are affected in ways that I think a lot of brands actually don't maybe fully appreciate just because third-party cookies in particular get so much attention. And one point that often kind of causes the light bulb to come on a little bit is we're always talking about third-party cookies. First-party cookies are being limited in important and significant ways. And what that does is it has implications for disciplines that previously might have been considered a lot less controversial or a lot less invasive from a privacy standpoint. So just things like basic web analytics, basic on-site personalization. These are things that most industry professionals don't consider to be super invasive from a privacy standpoint. They're pretty strictly sort of like measurement use cases. They don't involve cross-site tracking, but because of changes to first-party cookies, and these changes are being enforced like by browsers, right? You see limitations there that I think a lot of brands don't necessarily know about. So it's happening at a bunch of different levels, right? The browsers are making changes not only to third-party cookies, but also first-party cookies. If you go kind of a level down, the operating systems themselves are making changes that affect how browsers behave by default. For example, like every time iOS increments, like from 16 to 17, we see the implications of that in our clients' data very clearly in terms of, again, signal loss, difficulty with identity management and that kind of stuff. And the last thing I would call out, falling under this umbrella of signal loss or data deprecation, is just the increasingly challenging and increasingly complicated regulatory environment, right? I think a lot of folks know about GDPR and CCPA and the other scary four-letter acronyms, right? But the truth is, like here in the US, we're moving to a place where almost every state is going to have their own law that's kind of a CCPA equivalent, let's say. And these laws are going to have a lot in common, but they're not going to be identical. And there doesn't seem to be any future in the near term where there's some kind of federal level standard across the US as a whole. And so what that means is you have this patchwork quilt now about what data you can capture, in which jurisdiction, with what kind of consent, how long can you retain that, how can you use that data? So complying with that, again, like fragmented, challenging regulatory environment typically means data loss in some fashion. And so, yes, third-party cookies are a super important kind of tool in the toolbox that's going away, but it's far from being the only change that marketers and advertisers need to know about. And so we put that under that broader category of just sort of signal loss more generally.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's so much to unpack. There's so much to cover.
I think there's one other thing that maybe we can splice in, but I think the different sort of allocations of your advertising and media budget are going to be affected in different ways by some of the changes that Google is proposing, but also have already been affected by some of the changes that ITP has been enforcing and, sort of other browser environments. The area probably where there will be the most effect is in broad open internet programmatic advertising, where you are kind of investing in a multifaceted publisher network to try and drive baseline exposure and inbound and onboarding into your digital property, into your advertising business, into your business. That area is probably going to be affected the most because I think it's the most dependent on these anonymous IDs that are going to be regulated. And there isn't a ton of first-party data in that ecosystem. There's not generally a ton of first-party data in header bidding and sort of generally the programmatic ad networks. They're probably going to be the most effective. And I think that's where businesses should be thinking about how to most strongly kind of mitigate some of the impact of these changes. And that's where I think you've got things like the Topics API that Google is proposing, but you've also got alternative IDs like UID 2.0 and Newstar and LiveRamp have interesting offerings in that space. So I think there's a lot of people working on that problem of how to kind of solve for the true anonymous programmatic part of media, because that'll be maybe the most affected. I think somewhere in the middle is where the walled gardens will fall. When you look at things like Facebook and Google and Pinterest and Twitter and TikTok and Snapchat, those guys are going to continue to have really strong first-party data sets. And so especially for advertisers who also have really strong first-party data sets, particularly like retail and increasingly media is doing a good job at capturing first-party data, I think those will be maybe less affected because the deterministic identity information can be a way that they can communicate with the walled gardens. Advertisers and walled gardens can continue to communicate. So I still think there will be some efficacy there, maybe not as impacted by some of these changes, but there will be some impact, again, particularly for the totally anonymous users. And then I think the space where you'll see the least impact is really kind of more of the internal use cases for your digital data that really aren't dependent on cookies really at all. You've got things like analytics and C360s, and even to some degree, some of the CDP efforts that you're doing. I think to the degree that you're trying to analyze your data and interact more deeply and personalize to your user base, that's where I think you'll probably see the least amount of effect from these changes. So there's definitely kind of a strata of impact, kind of at the top being the DSP, SSP programmatic landscape, and at the bottom being more of your sort of highly controlled internal use cases for how you'll kind of see an impact from the death of cookies.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's so much to unpack. So we'll dive into a couple more questions here in following the series along. We'll dive into first-party data strategy and how that can help alleviate some of the pains and data loss and some of what you discussed. So make sure you stay tuned. Thanks for joining us, guys. So we're on our second question. And Nick, I'll pass this one to you first. What challenges or roadblocks do businesses typically encounter when transitioning your customers to first-party data collection and tracking? So what does that look like, and how can those be overcome?
It's a good question, Dave, because it's a really big question. So I think when we talk about having a first-party data strategy as a sort of solution to the challenges being posed by things like third-party cookie loss, I think it's important to just lay out to start with what do we mean by first-party data strategy? I think the most common thing that brands are thinking about in terms of first-party data is these rich kind of identity-laden data sets that they might have. Think about things like CRM records or point-of-sale data, like in-store sales and that kind of stuff. And brands are thinking a lot about, do I have the tooling that I need to be able to bring in this rich identity-laden data and augment other data sets that I have so that I can do things like target paid media campaigns using this kind of first-party data. Staying with that definition of a first-party data strategy, I think the biggest obstacle that a lot of brands face is what I would just call succinctly the value exchange. There are a lot of brands that just by the nature of their business, the vertical they're in, the business model they use, they just don't have a lot of first-party data. That's not their fault, right? It's not a criticism, but nevertheless, it does mean that they're sort of relatively less well-suited to take advantage of what we expect for example, like media targeting methods of the future to look like, right? I think if we start from a premise of, you want to be fueling these AI-driven models with really like high-quality inputs that are unique to your business, if you don't have that kind of first-party data, you are, relatively speaking, kind of challenged in that respect. And so what a lot of brands are having to think about, and it's not a trivial undertaking, is that value exchange. And if the nature of our business is such that we don't have a lot of first-party data, how can we change the way that we do business so that we begin to have more first-party data? And that's going to look like a lot of different things for a lot of different businesses. But that value exchange, so that you put yourself in a position to actually have that kind of rich, interesting first-party data to use, is a really important roadblock that organizations need to be able to navigate. There's another definition of a first-party data strategy, though, that I would like to just touch on briefly as well, Dave, if I could, and that is, regardless of the type of data that you're talking about, is it CRM data, in-store sale data, this kind of stuff, I think brands are thinking a lot more about how much ownership they have over how that data gets collected to begin with, how it's managed, how it's distributed, how it's shared with partners, and that kind of stuff. And so there's another way to think about a first-party data strategy, which is just that brands need to, frankly, kind of take control back, right? Instead of kind of delegating control out to the sort of third parties that we all know who they are, right? Google, Meta, and the rest. How do brands begin to kind of stop allowing these third parties to use their digital footprints as like their playgrounds for like scraping as much data as possible off their sites and mobile apps and things, and instead become a lot more kind of intentional and just have a lot more control over exactly what data is being collected to begin with, who that data is being shared with after the fact, how that data is being managed to make sure it's in compliance with all the, the various regulatory requirements and all that kind of thing. Whether it's that kind of rich identity-laden first-party data that I think we tend to think of more commonly, or it's more like first-party ownership of the data supply chain, if you will. Both of those are really important. The ownership of the supply chain is one where I think a lot of companies are rapidly realizing they just don't have that kind of control. And so looking for the right systems to put in place to get more control over that is another big hurdle to overcome.
Yeah, I think that's something that we're seeing a lot too in MetaRouter. And I think, it almost seems like the market is increasingly focusing more and more businesses toward this inevitable conclusion that they have to take back control of their data, and that delegating it is becoming increasingly less practical. And I think part of the reason for that is it's a bit of a war of attrition. There's just so many concerns now that need to be mitigated. I mean, you've had everything from, privacy controls from a government regulatory standpoint with GDPR and CCPA, but you also have now sort of private sector controls in the form of what the browsers are doing to try and restrict tracking and what OSs are doing. You also have, big public sort of legal ramifications in the form of like Cambridge Analytica, but a lot of other things that look a lot like Cambridge Analytica. And you have, leaks, which end up in, significant class action lawsuits. Like there's so many. You have to protect the privacy, you have to protect the quality, you have to protect the compliance exposure, you have to, control the security and how and where the data is routed. And the problem with having a dozen different sort of disparate, like a tag manager handling this portion of the data and maybe a specific custom job that's collecting this, and maybe these 12 site tags that are collecting into these 12 ecosystems. The problem is you have to have a specific answer for all of these increasingly complex things, privacy, compliance, security, et cetera, and multiplying those across all your different use cases, especially with AI coming in and not just becoming one downstream use case, but actually an exponential accelerant of downstream use cases. Now you just have so many battlefronts where you're having to control so many aspects of the data that it will eventually be impossible, I think, to manage all of those concerns at every single one of those junctures. And I think that's why we feel like the market is inevitably, more and more of the market is inevitably coming to the conclusion that it's better to have one kind of central first-party control point where all of your data comes in, those risks and those opportunities and the value and the normalization and the quality and the privacy and the compliance, check all those boxes, and then distribute downstream to all these use cases, internal, external, paid media, advertising, marketing, CDP, C360, warehousing, like all these different use cases for this stuff, have them all be the beneficiary of one controlled central framework. And I think that, that's obviously what MetaRouter is trying to do, but it does seem like there's a lot of focusing mechanisms that are going to be driving the market kind of to some of those conclusions.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep up with. Nick, did you have anything else to add?
No, I think that's a good place to leave it. But the summary would just be the first-party data strategy is about more than just like what kind of data you're talking about and does it have identity tied to it. It's really about that kind of supply chain or that sense of ownership from the point of collection, like Greg was saying, down through distribution of that data to all the different use cases that you're trying to satisfy.
Yeah, and a good place to start is really having an understanding of what that looks like for your organization, right? And kind of taking that first step to have a conversation with the Merkles and the Cardinal paths and the MetaRouters to understand, kind of assess where you're at and where you're going. So let's talk a little bit about a world without third-party cookies. What are the alternative tracking methods that businesses consider in the near term and in the long term? And like, kind of where do you see this going?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think third-party cookies are primarily a mechanism for advertising, which I will get to. I think for any use case around tracking that isn't necessarily dependent on like a third-party cookie, I think it's not going to have a huge effect. I don't think you need a really strong alternative approach. I think in that scenario, you just want a good, highly controlled and owned approach. So I think if you're starting to build, analytics in a really powerful way for your business, or building a C360 in a powerful way for your business, and really kind of starting to measure what your users are doing and tracking that behavior for various different use cases that are not advertising related, I think one of the most important things to think about is just having a really strong ID for your business. I think we've seen a lot of customers really struggle with having the identities that they depend on for their business be inside of some kind of monolithic ecosystem, or too heavily dependent on one vendor, or too heavily dependent on basing everything off of maybe Adobe's ID or Salesforce's ID or Google's ID. And I think it's difficult as a business to really scale if you are heavily dependent on a proprietary identifier for your users and how you're doing tracking. I would really encourage any business to develop kind of an independent, autonomous ID for your business that you can kind of use to track users across sessions and across functions within your business, that then, of course, can be heavily leveraged and attached to the IDs within walled gardens or the IDs within, your data cloud or your marketing cloud. But ideally, you have some kind of control and autonomy over how you are keeping track of your users, because I do think that's an interoperability that's going to be really important for any business. The other thing that's worth talking about is advertising, and that's where obviously the third-party conversation becomes very important. And without even really realizing it, a lot of the vendors that most businesses are using for things like programmatic advertising or social advertising or paid media is dependent on third-party cookies. The tags that they are running on their site and the tags that are running on the publisher's sites are really negotiating on these IDs, and those are going to kind of go away. And so suddenly this thing that used to be just handled behind the scenes for you is probably going to be thrust into the conversation, because you might see dashboards and performance start to dip. You might see the precision of your efforts start to dip. And so this is where you want to think about kind of taking a proactive approach to alternative methods, as opposed to just saying, I'm sure the whole landscape's going to figure it out, because Google's got some pretty tight timelines, and it doesn't seem like there's a super strong centralized effort from the paid media and programmatic world to solve this problem. There's a lot of different approaches that groups are taking, but adoption to like completely alternative methods has been somewhat slow. So it's probably important that businesses have some proactivity as an advertiser to kind of push this. And so the two primary ones that I would think about is first, lean into your first party data strategy if you have it. Obviously, being able to capture as much deterministic known, in a lot of cases PII, but just like known information about your users on your own digital property is going to give you a sustainable position even when third-party cookies die. If you have a majority of your users that you can identify in a meaningful way, not third-party cookie anonymous identifiers, but known identifiers, you're still going to be able to operate in a lot of ways as business as usual. You're still going to be able to do activation and media orchestration. You're still going to be able to measure and convert on your own website. It is still a good means with which to execute the current state of paid media and advertising and programmatic. For those who don't have a really strong access to PII or access to deterministic information or known identifiers for users, or just a ton of first-party data at all, this is where you really need to start looking at modern frameworks. And I think, one of those is sort of the alternative advertising ID space. And that's where you see things like UID 2.0 and LiveRamp's Portrait ID and Neustar's Fabric ID and Big ID. And there's a lot of options out there, and they all have different strengths and weaknesses. I think that this is a compelling potential strategy for offsetting some of the dependency, especially on kind of the activation and targeting side, for offsetting some of the drop in availability of anonymous vendor-specific IDs. But a lot of those systems are pretty dependent on PII. And so again, for those who don't have really any strong PII, it may not be a holistic solution. It may help move the needle and kind of close the gap on what's being lost with third-party cookie death, but I don't think it'll close it entirely. And that's where the other thing that's really worth considering is Privacy Sandbox, which is Google's alternative to third-party cookies, and other frameworks like the Storage Access API that Safari's going to have and some things. But if you really start to look at these things, they are pretty compelling answers to the death of cookies. I mean, Google has laid out a pretty functional, compelling alternative to cookie-based programmatic paid media. And they have some very specific APIs like the Protected Audiences API and the Attribution Reporting API and the Topics API that aim to allow for kind of the current state of paid media to be still as functional as it is today. But it is going to look like a very different implementation method. It is going to look like a lot more of this information being put into the browser as the primary negotiation point, as opposed to sort of back-end communication like it used to be. And it's all going to be kind of done under Chrome's control of the access to that data and the privacy of that data, and ideally with a heavier focus on consent, which generally we think is a pretty good thing for the market and we're pretty supportive of. But it's a lift from an implementation standpoint to switch onto those new frameworks. So that's where I think you as a business want to start having your technical teams and your marketing teams and your agency and maybe your SI, pushing them to start to think about this stuff, explore this stuff, push your vendor landscape, like ask the vendors that you spend paid media money on, are they going to be adopting Privacy Sandbox? How are they going to be adopting Privacy Sandbox? And start to look at tools like MetaRouter, which, the goal for MetaRouter is to help businesses implement their digital properties to always be integrated with the most modern frameworks for how you do orchestration, how you do data collection, how you do integration, and how you do tagging. And so we will likely be adopting Privacy Sandbox in kind of a managed, holistic way and helping our enterprises make that jump. And if that's something you as a business feel is going to be important for you, hopefully we can help as many businesses make this transition before cookies die so that, there isn't as much of a thrash when that change starts to happen.
Yeah, Nick, I've said this to you. I think it's kind of like a lot of organizations are driving around with the service engine soon light on, and you don't really do anything until you start hearing something like clatter under the hood, right? So just curious, as kind of the tip of the spear based on where your org spends a lot of time, are you guys seeing kind of the same thing, or more and more people placing an emphasis on learning more about it or making changes? What are you guys hearing?
Yes, I mean, we definitely see more and more organizations starting to ask more specific questions, about specific alternatives. Some of the things that Greg talked about, Privacy Sandbox probably being the one that we get the most questions about or hear the most interest in. But what I would say, just to add a little bit to what Greg laid out, is when I look at organizations that are well positioned and taking concrete strides and actually accomplishing sort of tangible outcomes in terms of third-party cookie deprecation readiness. Wow, that doesn't quite roll off the tongue. But the organizations that are doing well and making progress on readiness are organizations that frankly have done a little bit of an assessment of their specific use cases, whether that's marketing, advertising, analytics, warehousing, whatever it is, and just doing a very straightforward assessment of how does the loss of third-party cookies affect what we're trying to get done in this area, right? And so I guess what I would say is, like a lot of big, hairy, nasty problems, one of the ways that you can set yourself up to be successful is just start breaking this down into some smaller problems, right? Go, department by department or use case by use case and have a bit of a current state assessment. Where are we today? What's our risk exposure for third-party cookie loss? And then if you can take that kind of structured approach, all of a sudden the alternative approaches that you asked about, Dave, start to become a little bit clearer, and it feels a little bit less like this sort of generalized sky is falling sort of catastrophe, and a little bit more like there actually are specific, achievable, realistic next steps that you can take. And so it's going to look very different for every organization, of course. But like I said, what I see in common across organizations that are making strides is they have done that kind of assessment, and so they have a clear view of what they're aiming for.
Yeah, knowing where you stand is critical. Great info, guys. Thank you again so much for joining us again. And we'll have another question kind of talking about site performance and how that ranks or stacks up against some of the changes going on as well in terms of marketing effectiveness. So make sure you stay tuned. Thanks for joining us, guys.